Florida is an unusual place to hear about bear attacks, or at least it used to be. In the mid-70s, we'd nearly eradicated black bears out of the entire state, with only around 400 specimens remaining. The southern end of the state had none left in it at all. But since conservation efforts came into effect, we've slowly gotten their numbers up to nearly 3,000. Still, to this day, Florida has no fatalities due to bear attacks on record at all. Well, at least they didn't, until now. Sure, we've seen a few encounters here and there, but the South has remained relatively peaceful as far as bear attacks go. So let's have a look at Jerome, located near Collier County, where this incident took place. This little community has less than 300 residents living there, and it's practically shoulder to shoulder with the Big Cypress Wildlife Management Area. Big Cypress is home to the most intensely observed black bear populations in the south of Florida, boasting a population of around 700. But Jerome isn't made to be so close to this kind of threat. Most people there live on acreages, spaced several acres away from each other. With most of the residents being around retirement age, it was only a matter of time before a curious animal made its way onto someone's property. And that day finally came on May the 5th, 2025. Sue Story lived on a property nestled right next to the woods. Sue and her maternal grandfather, Robert Markle, lived on the property in two separate campers. Grandpa Bob was still perfectly capable of caring for himself, and neither of them wanted him to move to an old age home just yet. Such a move would have forced him to give up his beloved dog Diesel. Diesel was a 13-year-old rescue that Robert loved to distraction. Robert agreed to live with Sue on one condition: that he and Diesel could stay in another camper, located just a few yards from Sue's front door. He'd be close enough that she could keep an eye on him, but in his own place, where he could have some sense of independence. That night, Robert hadn't slept well. The summer heat was creeping in, and the nights were starting to get muggy, sweaty, and the thrift store fan wasn't doing much to relieve the heat. Finally, at 4:30 that morning, Robert stretched out his achy 89-year-old legs and shuffled to his front door. Diesel, geriatric and half dead, dragged his own stiff little legs off the bed and dutifully followed his master to the door. Robert opened it, hoping that a breeze would cool off the camper. Diesel decided that he might as well head off to relieve his bladder while he was up, so he headed out to the long grass. Robert didn't know it, but the moment his camper door squeaked open, a black bear was walking along the forest's tree line. It stopped dead in its tracks when it heard the unexpected sound. Its eyes followed Diesel as he trotted off. The animal moved over to the trailer out of curiosity. The human smells were strange, with a hint of food sorts wafting out into the night. Now that the dog was away, it might as well take the opportunity to investigate. Gingerly, it put its paw into the trailer. The structure creaked slightly with the weight, but Robert didn't hear it. He'd already fallen asleep again. It took another step, and then another, until it had squeezed its entire body through the narrow door's opening. This time, the camper screamed in protest, with nearly 400 pounds of additional weight resting upon it. The animal walked over to investigate the strange living thing that was making the snoring noises at the far end of the camper. As it made its way through the claustrophobic space, it knocked over several items on the shelves. At last, Robert was roused. He shot up from his bed like a cork, confused at what had awoke him and completely unable to see in the dark. Then Diesel appeared in the doorway and let out a terrified yelp at the sight of the massive animal. The bear roared, and Robert let out a soft moan when the realization of what was happening hit him. And that chain of events was what triggered the murderous reaction out of the bear. It pounced on the closest thing to it, Robert. It smashed right on top of the old man, one of its paws bearing down on Robert's throat. The sudden pressure was so great that Robert's windpipe collapsed into itself, cutting off almost all airflow. He tried to scream in pain as his ribs shattered and his sternum was crushed by the force, but his ruined windpipe wouldn't release enough air to manage more than a labored wheeze. Diesel backtracked and shot under the camper, frozen in fear by the sounds of scrapes and beastly grunts above him. The bear emerged, dragging Robert by the shoulder. Robert was clawing at his throat with his free hand. What little air he could suck in through that flattened windpipe was nothing more than a bloody gurgle from the blood rushing into his lungs. By the time he and the animal reached the tree line, Robert had blacked out from lack of air. As it dragged him, Robert's pants, with his wallet still inside the pocket, slipped off his limp legs long before they came to a stop just 70 yards away. Then the animal tore at Robert until the old man, who was in no condition to resist at all, stopped his labored breathing. During the assault, Robert's shirt was torn off. Half his scalp hung off the side of his head. His throat was ripped out and the animal even sampled at his thigh. When it had its fill, it found a hollow in the dirt another 30 yards deeper into the brush and stowed the rest of Robert inside it for later eating. Then, it proceeded to drag branches and leaves over to hide it from other scavengers. Unfortunately, Diesel had found his courage at last. He'd gone into the camper when the sun came up, only to find that his master wasn't there. Then he followed the scent of where Robert was dragged with his nose. When he came upon them, Diesel started barking hysterically. The predator set out after him, and poor Diesel, stone deaf, half blind, and already a terribly frightened little thing by his very nature, ran off to the only place he instinctively knew that there would be safety. Diesel ran back home, yowling for his life, but no dog his age stood a chance at outrunning a fully grown black bear. Towels from the dog woke Sue, and when she looked out the window, she saw the dog and the bear streaking out of the forest. In one quick motion, it swiped out a paw, hooking Diesel by the hind leg and proceeding to rip the loyal canine to shreds. Sue's call to 911 came in at 7 a.m. She believed that her father was most likely trapped inside his camper and that Diesel just happened to come across the bear himself. She couldn't exit her house to make sure, or she'd be mauled too. The bear lumbered back into the woods, discarding Diesel's torn little corpse in the yard, leaving Sue to yell out the window for her grandfather until the sirens came up her driveway. Those first few minutes were confusing to say the least. The camper was in disarray, but there wasn't a spot of blood to be found anywhere. Yes, there was a torn up dog in the yard, but of the bear, there was no sign. Surely a bear attack would have resulted in an absolute bloodbath. They followed the drag marks until they found a pair of pants with Robert's wallet inside, also devoid of blood. A few yards more, and they found the shirt, shredded and covered in blood. Next, they saw a ruined but unmistakably human hand poking out of a mound of forest debris. Given their lack of experience with bear attacks at first, they thought that this looked like a weak attempt to conceal a body by another human. But all of their suspicions that this was murder evaporated when they saw the state of Robert Markle's body. He was completely unrecognizable, as torn up as the corpse of the canine 100 yards away was. Trail cams were set up, hoping to catch the bear returning to the cache it made for Robert, and they euthanized 3 adult males whose size matched up to the bite marks. They've yet to confirm which of them was the culprit to this terrible tragedy. Unfortunately, this has sparked a debate on whether or not all bears in southern Florida should be killed or rehomed all over again before another innocent man, woman, or heaven forbid a child is dragged off into the woods toward their vicious and deadly final affliction.
The winter months in Germany are bitterly cold, and Mark Vogel spent almost all of his time inside the 3-bedroom house he'd inherited from his parents 10 years ago. This story actually starts back in 1994 with the untimely deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Vogel. Mark was always a little socially awkward, and he harbored a love for all things creepy and crawly since he was a boy. He even went on to study zoology, so that he could pursue a career surrounded by reptiles, scorpions, and spiders. That was where Mark was, at university as a second-year student in Munich, when he received the news that his parents had died in a car accident on their way to work. He inherited the house and enough money that ensured that he'd never had to work a day in his life. It's not that Mark became a rich orphan or anything, but he certainly had the freedom to take a few years off with no need to worry about money. But instead, Mark decided to withdraw into himself and the house he'd inherited, cutting off all contact with the few friends he'd had and dropping out of school completely. He only had his 2 pet snakes, a tarantula and a pair of rats, for company in that empty house. The only people Mark ever really saw were the clerks at the corner shop where he did his groceries once a week. But even then, Mark's interactions with them were mostly small talk about the weather. They weren't aware of Mark's sudden withdrawal from the outside world, his terrible loss, or the growing obsession with reptiles and spiders that he was developing. What was previously a deep respect and love for the animals that the rest of humanity avoided at all costs became an all-consuming obsession. Mark began to collect specimens from all over Europe, acquiring most of the reptiles and arachnids illegally. By the time the 2000s came around, Mark became proficient with a computer and the underbelly of the internet. His collection went from a few purchases a year to spending thousands of euros every month, hunting down even more animals for his growing collection. He no longer even switched on the lights in his home. Instead, the building was illuminated by the heat lamps from over 200 cages. There were so many of them that he even started placing new tanks in his kitchen and bathroom floors because he simply ran out of space for it all. Even the mice and crickets needed to feed them all were kept in tanks, where Mark meticulously bred and then fed them to his many, many creatures. He had a python, a corn snake, South American geckos, and bearded dragons, just to name a few. But most of all he had spiders. Lots and lots of spiders. The gigantic African huntsmen and tarantulas were displayed with pride. The nondescript but deadly brown recluse, and the eye-catching orb weavers, and vibrant Australian peacock spiders. Mark had them all. The stranger and the more venomous, the better. But none was as prized as his tank of black widows that had a place set right in his bedroom. Now, you'd think that a man with such an extreme hoarding problem of almost 300 tanks full of living creatures would be living in an absolute mess. But quite the contrary. Mark kept his tanks and his surroundings almost painfully clean. His stacks of books on arachnids and serpents were neatly stacked in alphabetical order. He spent his days polishing the glass tanks and meticulously separating the 8-legged creatures into temporary holdings so that he could clean inside the cages too. There was never a dirty dish or pile of laundry lying around. The spotless house was always tropically warm, with most of his inheritance going to the electricity bill to keep the heat lamps going. On the morning of February the 19th, Mark got up at 5 in the morning. Winter in Germany meant that the sun wouldn't be up until well past 8, but it was feeding day, and Mark wanted to get an early start. He slipped on his winter boots, took out the trash, and got straight to work. It would take him all day to visit every one of the holdings in the house. Like always, he began with his beloved black widows, but uncharacteristically, Mark accidentally left the smallest sliver of the tank's lid open. It was only a matter of time before the 7 widows inside realized that their holding was no longer secure. Mark went about his day, systematically feeding every one of the macabre inhabitants of his glass tanks. Inevitably, the first of the 7 found its way out of the tank. After hours inside the bedroom, it found Mark's winter boots, still warm from Mark's feet from that morning when he'd taken out the trash. It crawled inside, and there it stayed while 2 more spiders crawled out of the cage and started to explore. Mark never even noticed the missing spiders or the open tank when he finally returned to his bedroom late that afternoon. He slipped on the boots that held the deadly little predator and headed out the door to reach the grocery store before it got dark. The moment Mark put his right foot into that boot, 2 things happened. He crushed the spider with his big toe, and as he squished it against the leather of the boot, it reacted with the only weapon it had, its fangs. They were so tiny that Mark didn't even feel the teeth penetrating his skin, and he simply walked to the store, made his usual small talk, and left to walk back the 2 blocks he'd come. Halfway home, Mark's foot began to ache slightly, and by the time he'd kicked off his boots back in his bedroom, half of his right foot was already red and hot. Mark didn't think too much of it at first. He just thought it was a blister and decided to go have it checked out in the morning if it got any worse during the night. 2 hours later, Mark got up to fix himself some dinner, but his foot, that had been only a mild hindrance before, simply gave out on him. It throbbed painfully, and it was now starting to turn purple. Despite his shortening breath and the sweat forming on his brow, Mark was still hesitant to go to the emergency room. It meant leaving his house, his street, and everything that was familiar to him. If it got to that point, he'd rather have an ambulance treat him inside his home. His deathly fear of retreating outside his own door was an even greater threat than dying. Mark had tried to avoid reality for the past 10 years. He was deeply agoraphobic. And as the night progressed, Mark's condition just became worse and worse. He blamed his burning stomach and the nausea on hunger because he hadn't had the strength to make himself something to eat. He began to run a fever that was high enough on its own to validate a stay in the hospital. And still, Mark refused to pick up the phone. All the while, the black widows in the tank were escaping into the house, one by one. Now, normally a bite from a black widow wouldn't have caused this extreme reaction, and in all honesty, they're rarely fatal. But Mark had been virtually immobile for the last decade. He was already showing worrying signs of diabetes, and his terrible diet and lack of exercise had weakened his heart. Mark became an expert at convincing himself that his long list of symptoms was not nearly as serious as it was, anything to avoid leaving his home. Even without the bite, he was a ticking time bomb, and now the venom was thriving in his weakened body. For 2 days, Mark lay on his living room floor, the flesh in his foot beginning to die and turn black. The fever and the pain in his abdomen and chest made him delirious. Neighbors reported hearing someone shouting for their mother 2 days after he'd been bitten. Finally, on February the 21st, almost 3 whole days after the initial bite, Mark, dehydrated and out of his mind, died on his living room floor. His lungs flooded with fluid, and the weight on his chest caused a massive heart attack. For the next week, that's where Mark lay while his pets became hungrier and hungrier. It was the lizards who broke out first, and during their explorations they knocked over a few of the tank's lids, leaving the hundreds of spiders free to crawl over the house. Inevitably, they found Mark's body. In the heated structure, the decomposition set in quickly, and his corpse offered them the only source of food they could find. After not seeing Mark for 9 days, the shop clerks called in for a wellness check. Mark was never out of sync with his routine, and they knew that he had no family or friends to check up on him. When police arrived, they could smell the decomposing body before they even stepped onto the porch. Inside, the stench was overwhelming, and the house was alive with scuttling and movement from the many, many creatures swarming all over every surface. Eerily illuminated by their tank's blue and red lights, it smelled and looked like a horror movie. They'd started on the soft tissue on Mark's cheeks and the protein-rich eyeballs. They'd moved over to his tongue, and the bigger lizards had even taken chunks out of his bare arms. His body was almost entirely black from the swarm that had settled upon him, crawling out of his open mouth, nesting in his hair. In the end, there were just too many venomous animals inside the home to allow the authorities to move the body out of an open door. If they got out, it was almost certain that they'd find their way to one of the other homes on the street. They left Mark where he lay and threw fumigation canisters into the door, killing every single creature inside, lizards, snakes, spiders, and all. 2 days after the mass killing, they opened all the doors and windows and stepped inside to remove the remains. Mark was buried with the last remaining money still left in his estate that he hadn't managed to spend on exotic pets. And he was buried alone, with no one left to attend the recluse's funeral, not even his beloved pets that had caused his terrifying final affliction. Barbara Paschke loved bears. In fact, she loved them so much that she broke the law so that she could see them up close. By leaving out sunflower seeds and millet in her backyard, she enticed them to her back door. She admired the impressive animals, watching safely from behind her windows. Not only was she feeding the bears for her own satisfaction, but she also felt like she was ensuring they had food in times of hardship. However, it is illegal to feed bears, and for very good reason. Bears can become habituated to humans. They learn to associate people with food and a free meal. And if that food is ever withdrawn, then they can become aggressive, destructive, and deadly. By feeding her beloved wild bears, Barbara was not only putting her neighbors in danger, but she was also putting herself in danger. On top of that, she inadvertently put the bears in harm's way. If they ever turned aggressive or were seen getting too close to people's properties, then they would be removed or worse, killed by the authorities. But Barbara didn't think of those consequences, and even when she was cited for her behavior in 2012, she continued to feed black bears in her neighborhood. But now something was about to go horribly wrong. Barbara was an 85-year-old woman who lived beside Ashley Lake near Kalispell in the northwestern corner of Montana. It was a beautiful location. Her rural home was on the outskirts of Flathead National Forest, which lies adjacent to Glacier National Park, an area known for its bears. There may have been a reason for Barbara's careless behavior, something that changed her perspective on things. In 2009, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and her family believed that this altered her perspective on how to preserve wildlife wisely and safely. On September 27, 2015, a time when bears were filling up their fat reserves ready for the long winter months ahead, a bear walked into Barbara's yard. It was expecting the usual food that she scattered about her lawn, but this time, Barbara hadn't put any out that day. So instead, the bear went searching for some. It was a young, female black bear. She had learned to associate Barbara's house with an easy meal. The bear walked across the yard and towards the house. It sniffed around the sides of the building, working its way towards the back door. Inside, Barbara was unaware that one of her favorite animals was so close. But this wasn't just a curious bear. It was a hungry bear, and it was a conditioned bear. Somehow, the bear managed to force itself inside Barbara's house and began turning the place upside down. When Barbara heard a noise in her kitchen, she went to investigate. Then, as she peered around the corner of the hallway, she spotted the bear rummaging through her things. It was one of the black bears she was familiar with, but inside her home it looked much bigger. Barbara froze and watched in horror for a few moments as the bear ransacked her house. She couldn't reach her phone without moving, and she would have to get past the bear to get out of her house. She was trapped. Nobody knows how the bear got inside the property, but it spotted Barbara shortly afterwards and lumbered towards her. With nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, the elderly lady braced herself for what was to come. The bear suddenly leapt up at Barbara, its jaws clacking, its powerful paws pushing her to the floor. Barbara let out a yell, but nothing could have prepared her for the attack that ensued. She crashed onto the floor, the air escaping from her lungs, and she gasped. She smacked the back of her head on the ground and looked up at the mighty beast. Its dripping jowls were just inches from her face. She could smell its breath. She could see directly into its dark, shiny eyes. The bear growled as it pushed its face into Barbara. She tried to protect herself, desperately trying to curl up into the fetal position and interlock her hands behind her neck. But she was still exposed. The bear tore into the old lady's flesh, its canines ripping into her shoulders and arms. It pinned her down with its large paws as its claws sliced her skin. Barbara screamed for help, and moments later the bear stepped off her, climbed up onto a work surface, and climbed out through one of the windows. The attack had only lasted a few seconds, but the damage had been done. As the adrenaline wore off, Barbara could now feel the intense, searing pain from the attack. She lay bleeding on the floor of her home, unable to move and unable to reach the phone. She was in a state of shock and in desperate need of help, but no one came. As the minutes ticked by, Barbara was losing consciousness. The wounds had cut deep into her muscle, torn tendons, and were festering with bacteria. She was fading fast, but Barbara was a fighter, and she managed to pull herself towards her home phone and call for help. Emergency services arrived within minutes. The sheriff's department, along with the wildlife response team, rushed to the rural scene. When officers broke into the property, they found the home completely ransacked and Barbara lying on the floor. They rushed to her side. Miraculously, she was still breathing. She was still alive, but only just. Barbara was ambulanced off to Kalispell Regional Medical Center in a critical condition. Nobody knew if she would make it. Over the next couple of days, doctors fought to save Barbara, and she was a tough lady. It looked like she was going to pull through, giving everyone the hope they needed. But then, tragically, on the morning of October 1st, she passed away from her injuries. Her death was a shock for the neighborhood. She was popular amongst the locals, and her loss was felt far and wide. Following the devastating attack, the whole community was put on high alert. There was a killer on the loose, and it wasn't afraid to break into people's homes to get what it wanted. Traps were set up to catch the bear responsible. Officers walked from door to door to warn people about the bear or bears in the area, but their efforts to capture the nuisance bear were thwarted when they discovered that somebody else in the neighborhood was also feeding the bears, And not only that, they continued to feed the bears even after hearing the news about Barbara and knowing an investigation was in full swing. With wildlife officers posted to the neighborhood night and day, they managed to catch 2 black bears. They weren't very old, only yearlings, but in their young lives they had become dependent on humans for food. The 2 bears confidently strolled into the neighborhood searching for food. The seed that various people had put out in their gardens had kept them coming back for more, but given the recent events, they were now seen as a threat to the community. With heavy hearts, the wildlife officers euthanized both of them. When the yearlings were taken away and examined, they had a significant amount of millet and sunflower seeds in their digestive tracts. The people who had deliberately fed the bears had now contributed to their deaths. The officers had no choice. The bears had learned that they could get an easy meal from the neighborhood and weren't going to stop coming back. It would be irresponsible to release potentially dangerous bears somewhere else when the bears are habituated to people. Scientific evidence suggests that bears pass on their nuisance behavior to their cubs too. So when these 2 black bears matured, they could bring their cubs back to the same neighborhood with potentially disastrous consequences. But the DNA from both the yearlings were not exact matches to the bear that was responsible for Barbara's death. Results did, however, show that the bear that attacked Barbara was a sister of one of the euthanized bears. After 3 weeks of setting up traps and scouting the area, the search for the bear was called off. There are thought to be around 15,000 black bears throughout Montana and 800 grizzlies. Brown bears are responsible for the most attacks across North America, but they are considered rare, and fatalities from them are rarer still. A black bear entering a home and fatally mauling someone has never been heard of before, and no known fatalities have ever occurred from bear attacks in Flathead's 2.5 million acre forest until now, after Barbara Paschke met her terrifying final affliction.